Have you received any gifts recently from God? Have you received any gifts from God? You can think about all the things that you've received from God as a gift. Today's a gift. Beautiful weather out there today. Sunshine is a gift. The air we breathe is a gift. The blue sky is a gift. Many, many things. But of course, the greatest gift we ever received from God was Jesus. Back in December 1999, Time magazine had a painted picture of Jesus on the cover and the headline, Jesus at 2000. And they were coming towards the end of the millennium and they wanted to reflect back on what were the most important things of the last 2,000 years. And in the article inside, Reynolds Price, the author, he said, the single most powerful figure, not merely in these 2 millenniums, but in all human history, has been Jesus of Nazareth. And, people might say, well, what gives him the right to say that? That's pretty bold, to say he's the most important figure. But you see, on any measure, Jesus has affected the world more than any other individual. There have been more books written about Jesus than anybody else, more songs written about Jesus than anybody else, more buildings dedicated to Jesus than anybody else. And so Jesus is by far and away the most influential figure. And, after 2000, you can still see there's so many magazine covers that you could pick up that include Jesus. But these are two that I just pulled out, and these are National Geographic. National Geographic's not even a religious magazine, right? But they include Jesus on the front. You know why? Because he sells. You put something about Jesus on the front and it sells. And so you have National Geographic, the story of Jesus, the real Jesus. Even people like Kanye West released a song in 2019, Jesus is King. And you can't ignore Jesus. And of course, lots of focus has been on the birth of Jesus over the last month or so. Lots of people have been drawn their attention to that. Back in 2013, you may recall that Prince William and Princess Catherine were expecting, and they had their child born 22nd of July 2013. The royal baby, Prince George Alexander Louis. And of course there was lots of speculation about that child because this was a child that was going to be born one day to be king. And it was interesting because in the Daily Telegraph, we were living in New South Wales at the time, and in the Daily Telegraph there was a lift out from the Sunday paper. And this was what it looked like. It said, "Oh baby," and then it says, "Is this the world's most anticipated childbirth since Jesus?" Now, obviously, when Prince William, Princess Kate got married and they're expecting a baby, 9 months later you expect there to be a baby, right? When they announce that they're expecting, 9 months later you expect that there's going to be a baby. But what this article in the paper is saying, and what many people may have just glossed over, is the fact that Jesus' birth was anticipated. It says here, is this the world's most anticipated childbirth since Jesus? The point is, Jesus' birth was anticipated, not 9 months in advance, but hundreds of years in advance. Jesus' birth was anticipated. In fact, Jesus fulfilled over 300 prophecies and allusions in his life on earth. There's no doubting that Jesus was the Messiah. And 700 years before Jesus was born, we know the story. In Micah 5:2, the Bible says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose going forths are from of old, from everlasting." Did you know there were 2 Bethlehems in the Holy Land at the time of Jesus? There was one in the north and one in the south. There was Bethlehem of Judah, but there was also a little town of Bethlehem in Galilee, which actually wasn't very far. I don't know if you can see it up there. It wasn't far from Nazareth. But the Bible prophecy had said Bethlehem in Judah. And that's where Jesus was taken to be born. Well, we're going to move on from that chapter. We want to move to Matthew chapter 2. And pick up your Bible if you have it. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 2. Because today the service is called After Christmas. And I don't know if you celebrate Christmas or celebrate the birth of Jesus or whatever you do over the holidays. The fact is, many people's attention has been drawn to the birth of Jesus. And maybe you've seen nativity scenes, you know, where you have maybe a stable and a manger and Jesus and Mary and Joseph are there, and maybe you've got the shepherds there. But you've usually got the wise men there too, right? However, biblically, they weren't there at the same time, the shepherds and the wise men. Let me demonstrate. Pick up your Bible, Matthew chapter 2. The birth of Jesus, you will also notice, is in Luke chapter 1. But we're going to go to Matthew chapter 2 and look at verse 1. It's now after Jesus was born, or in some people's terminology, after Christmas. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Bethlehem? No, they came to Jerusalem. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the wise men came to Jerusalem. So this is after the birth of Jesus. You know, sometimes we picture them all being there, you know, on the night Jesus was born. After Jesus was born, they came to Jerusalem. Verse 2, saying, where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and have come to worship him. Verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. You see, Herod the Great was born in Idumea. Where is Idumea? Anybody know where Idumea is? It's actually a sort of amalgamation of the word from Edom. If you know where Edom is, on the east side of the Jordan, there was Ammon, Moab, and Edom. And the Edomites, when the children of Israel, when the Judeans, the Jews, got taken captive to Babylon, the Edomites came round and occupied the land. And they became known as the Idumeans, or the Edomites became the Idumeans. Anyway, Herod was an Idumean. In other words, he wasn't a Jew. And so he's king of the Jews at the time. And he's concerned that somebody's being born king of the Jews. He is concerned. And he's troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Verse 4, and when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet. And then he reads out this verse we read before from Micah. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not of the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who shall shepherd my people Israel. Verse 7, then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the young child. And when you've found him, bring back word to me, that I may come and worship him also. When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. The question is, who were these wise men? In the original Greek language, the word is magi or magos or magoi in terms of the plural. And that word is used frequently in ancient times. It's sometimes used as a reference to the Persian priests were called magi in the language of their own country. You can read about the story of Balak and Balaam. Do you remember them? Back in the time when the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness, they were coming around into the land of Moab, and Balak, the king there, he was concerned about the Israelites moving into his land, and so he summoned Balaam to come and cast a spell over them. You remember that story? In the book of Numbers. And of course he tried to curse Israel. He was paid by Balak, come and curse Israel for me, would you? And he tried to curse Israel and was unable, but you could only bless Israel. And then under the inspiration of God, you find it says here, he says, under the inspiration of God, he says, a star shall come out of Jacob, a scepter shall rise out of Israel. And he was referring to Jesus there. So he would have been considered one of the wise men or one of the magi or he was a false prophet who I guess God turned into a true prophet by using his mouthpiece on that occasion. But who are these wise men? These magi. That same word, by the way, was used of, ever heard of Simon Magus? In the book of Acts, they come upon a fellow who's practicing sorcery. And he's called Simon Magus or Simon the Sorcerer. And that word sorcerer is magi. And so it was used, I guess you would say, in ancient times the word was used for sometimes the scientists of the day, but in those days the scientists of the day were heavily involved with the spiritual forces of the day. In Acts chapter 13, you even have a Jew who's called a magi. In Acts chapter 13 verse 6, you remember Barnabas and Saul are travelling, they come to Cyprus, they go to Paphos, and they encounter there a Jew who was a false prophet practicing sorcery, and he was called, the word used of him is magi. So who were these wise men that came? You know, in the 5th century, there's an Armenian text that gave them names. Maybe you've heard some of these names. Melkon, king of Persia, Gaspar, king of India, and Balthazar, king of Arabia. 5th century, very late. It's highly likely that those were names attributed to these wise men, not their actual names. This was something that was added later. There's an even later Syriac text that says the Magi came from China. But this is unlikely. But you see, when we're reading from the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew could have talked to Mary, right? I mean, Mary was there when the wise men showed up. He could get first-hand information. He didn't have to look through the records. He could have talked to Mary. Mary lived to an old age. And so he got his information, he could have got his information from Mary. He was obviously inspired by God to write the scriptures. And he records that they were from the east, that they saw his star, and they brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Some have speculated that Maybe these wise men came from Babylon. But we have to remember that Babylon had faded from the scene. They'd been conquered by the Persians. Or maybe they came from Persia. But the Persians were conquered by the Greeks. And at the time of Jesus, that area was occupied by the Parthians. Were these Babylonian astrologers or Persian priests? No, Babylon and Persia had already been conquered. So who could these people be? Who were these magi from the east? Well, according to archaeologist, researcher and author Brian Windle, he talks about a better candidate for the wise men would be the Nabateans. Don't know if you've heard of the Nabateans. Maybe you've seen some of the incredible rock carvings in Petra, either in pictures or some of you have been fortunate enough to go. But the Nabateans lived to the east of Jerusalem at this time. If you can see there on the map, this was the Nabatean kingdom at that time, at the time of Jesus. It had influence from Damascus in the north all the way through down to Saudi Arabia to a place called Hegra in the south and across the Sinai Peninsula. And this facade, which is it was made famous by the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. It featured in that. But this place was called Al-Khazni, or the treasury, because when Europeans first discovered it, they thought maybe there's treasure in there. This is not a building, this has been carved out of the rock. And we've since learned that this was likely the mausoleum of a man by the name of King Aretas IV of the Nabateans, who's mentioned in the Bible. He's mentioned in the Bible in 2 Corinthians 11:32. You remember that Paul was in Damascus and he talks there about Aretas the king. And they believe now that this is actually the mausoleum, or was the mausoleum, of Aretas IV. There he is. And he was, interestingly enough, he was the king ruling at the time of Jesus. So from 9 BC to 40 AD, he would have been the king in Nabatea. And if you've ever been to Petra or seen the pictures, you know how impressive those places can be. As I said, all the way down to Saudi Arabia to a place called Hegra. This is Hegra. And they have similar carvings into the rock. Quite amazing that they would take all of the time to carve all of that rock out, usually for tombs or even dwellings. There are still sometimes people living in those dwellings, but that is in the southern part of what would have been their kingdom at the time. Even the mother of Herod the Great was a woman by the name of Cypros, and she was a Nabatean princess from Petra. And this was the mother of Herod the Great. So could these wise men have come from Nabatea? Well, that's possible. The Nabateans were known as traders. So they would have traded in those items that they brought as gifts. These would have been noblemen. These have been wise men. So this wasn't your average trader. These were people of nobility. And they probably would have travelled at night, because it's pretty hot in the daytime. And so on the trade routes, they probably would have travelled at night. And because they travelled at night, no doubt they would have been familiar with the star formations and probably navigated by the stars, as ancient mariners used to do. And when a new star appeared, that would have caught their attention, because they would have been familiar with the night sky. They probably had access to ancient writings. We talked about the message of Balaam and Balak. They probably had access to that. We could think about the writings of Daniel in Babylon, where he forecast, he prophesied that the Messiah would come in Daniel chapter 9. Maybe they were aware of that also. And The Nabateans, we know, did trade and have in abundance gold, frankincense, and myrrh. This was on the line you can see here from Gaza to Hegra was a spice trade route that they often used. And you can imagine them coming from the south and maybe seeing that star and being redirected to Jerusalem and then to Bethlehem on their route as they came. Strabo, who was a first century Greek geographer, he talks about the Nabateans. He said, the Nabateans are a sensible people who are so much inclined to acquire possessions that they publicly fine anyone who has diminished his possessions. Can you imagine? Some things are imported wholly from other countries, but others, such as gold and silver and most of the aromatics, are produced in their country. In 155 AD, Justin Martyr, one of the early Christian writers, he wrote, Accordingly, the Magi from Arabia came to Bethlehem and worshipped the child and presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I can't say for certain that the wise men or the Magi were Nabateans, but it makes sense that they would have been. Regardless, it's interesting to note that whilst the people of Jerusalem, their role in God's great plan was to introduce the heathen to the Messiah, it's actually the heathen who come to Jerusalem to introduce Herod and the priests to the Messiah. They are the ones who come looking for him. And it is ironic to me that they come saying, where is he who's to be born King of the Jews? And Herod's concerned about the threat to his kingdom. And then he calls the chief priests and says, can you find out, can you search through here to find out where he's going to be born? And they said, in Micah 5:2, it said he's going to be born in Bethlehem of Judea. And they tell the wise men, and they go to find Jesus and worship him. But Herod and the priests don't. Don't you think that's ironic? They have in their possession the Word of God, which tells them where to find Jesus. And even though you've got these heathen coming from a foreign land who are not Jews, but they're looking at the signs and they've had access to ancient wisdom, and they come looking for Jesus, and they even draw attention. You wonder, when the wise men were coming from the east and they saw the star, why didn't the star just take them straight to Bethlehem? You ever wondered about that? Why have the star take them to Jerusalem? God's sat-nav is perfectly, capable of taking them directly to Bethlehem. Is that right? I mean, when they left Jerusalem, there's the star, let's follow it. And they go to Bethlehem. Why didn't God just take them from the east all the way to Bethlehem, never mind Jerusalem? I think God in his mercy, he wanted to alert the king and the priests and the nation to the fact that Jesus is going to be born, and whilst you've been asleep, we're going to get the people searching from the east to come, and I'm going to direct them to your court, King Herod, to draw your attention to the fact that something's happening. That the Messiah is coming. He's going to be born in Bethlehem. And they actually read it from the Bible to the people from the east, who then gladly go off to Bethlehem to find the child and to worship him and to give their gifts to him. While Herod and the priests don't even move from Jerusalem. Don't you think that's amazing? These heathen wise men from the east drew the attention of Jerusalem to the Messiah instead of the other way around. That is interesting. You see, God was getting the attention of this group of Gentiles who were open to more knowledge about God, who were open to the signs that God would reveal. Desire of Ages tells us that star that they saw was a distant company of shining angels. It's also interesting to note in Desire of Ages that God had informed them in a dream that the child was to be born. And so they came looking. They wanted to know. If we think about this story of the wise men, you know, I'm sure you've heard people say the wise still seek him, right? And that's true. The wise still seek Jesus. God's people knew the Lord was coming, but were unmoved. Heathen from the east knew less, but followed the signs. Herod died without ever meeting Jesus. Can you imagine that? King Herod the Great, he died having never met Jesus, but he had the opportunity to be one of the first to welcome Jesus into the world. The wise men found Jesus and rejoiced. And, well, we could say, well, this is a nice story. What's the big deal? So what? Well, Jesus is coming again. Jesus is coming again. And there were people who wanted to see the Messiah, and then there were others who were less enthusiastic, shall we say, about Jesus coming the first time. What will be our response? You know, the Bible, we read the passage in Matthew 2 where it says that when Herod heard that the King of the Jews was coming, that he was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. Are you troubled by the fact that Jesus is coming again? Or are you so glad? In fact, you can't wait for Jesus to come. I'm sure that if you have been around the shops in the last month or so, you will have heard the song Last Christmas. You could probably tell me the words. And then they made a movie. And I suppose, you know, I was thinking of calling the sermon Last Christmas, but I went with After Christmas. You might think of Last Christmas as 2024, but I guess here on the 27th of December you could call Last Christmas 2 days ago. But I want to think further forward than that. As we approach the end of the year, and by the time we meet again next Sabbath, we'll be into a new year, won't we? And my question is, will this be our last Christmas? No man knoweth the day or the hour, right? No man knoweth the day or the hour. But at some point in history, we're going to see our last Christmas. Because Jesus will ultimately come. We don't know the day or the hour, and we're grateful for that. God in his providence has not revealed that to us. And we also know that God is not slack concerning his promise to return, but he's patient, long-suffering, not willing that any should perish. But like the Jews of old, God has a people on earth whom he has commissioned, instructed, given the mission of preparing people to meet the Messiah. Is that right? We're among that group of people. Thankfully, it doesn't entirely rest upon us, small band as we are. God has people all over the world who have taken hold of the mission to prepare a people for the coming Messiah. And we're in possession of the Scriptures. There's many, many things that God has revealed about the second coming of Jesus, has He not? That are very helpful to us to know what it's going to look like before Jesus comes, what it's going to look like when Jesus comes, and perhaps more particularly also what it won't look like when Jesus comes. And God has given us that and I believe that's a great blessing. But just the hope in a world that is as dark as ours is right now, with everything that's going on, the hope and the knowledge that Jesus is coming, and He's coming to take us home to heaven. It's called the blessed hope in the Bible. I hope it's your blessed hope. And I hope that, like the wise men, we will want to know more about the Lord that is coming. And we will want to help others find Him so that they're ready when He comes too.